Hey y'all, Kenny here. Thanks for joining me. Got some parts for Dangerous Ranger number 2. I got a new cluster, countershaft gear, and I got a input shaft, main drive gear. Got some miscellaneous parts. I'm not replacing all the bearings. I maybe should, but I think in my experience they'll probably last as long as I need them to. But all this stuff, I got new plugs, expansion plugs to replace these rubber plugs that are in the cap. I did buy the thrust bearing, new seals, this little oil slinger. I called it an oil pump, but it actually does have a venturi action. It does actually pump fluid to feed that inner bearing. But I got all this from Cobra Transmissions. These guys are in Florida, and all this was $160 some to my door. That's including the gear lever retainer with the new seal on it. So you can get a set of bearings, I think about 150 bucks maybe. You can also get a kit that has the synchronizer blocker rings if you need those. So I've already transferred my bearings to both shafts. I pulled them off using this little clamshell bearing separator that's seen its better days. I have a little floor press, so I push them off with that. If you do drive them off, wear eye protection and use a soft drift of some kind to keep from having flying metal. To put them back on, I used heat. I put them on a hot plate, warm them up at about 275, maybe even 250. They'll just drop on. But if you decide to go that route, you be careful. You don't want to heat them up till you start to change the color of the metal. Actually, it's maybe less damaging to the bearings than trying to drive them on with a drift. If you do drive them on, again, wear eye protection. So again, I'm fixing this on the cheap. I'm not putting bearings in except the failed one, and I'm not taking this main shaft apart, replacing any synchronizer parts, because I drove it home and this thing works flawlessly. You can get a kit that includes these synchronizer blocker rings if you are having issues with the transmission scraping gears, not engaging well. If you need to take the shaft apart, it's not really complicated. You can get an exploded view online, and there's just some snap rings and the gears slide off. Pay attention to how these clutches are oriented. You can mark those with an arrow, and I don't think you have any trouble at all taking this shaft apart and putting it back together, especially if you've gotten this far in the process. So I've cleaned up the case with a pressure washer as best I could. It's clean on the inside anyway. And so assembly is just the reverse of disassembly. That's what it usually says in the Chilton's manual anyway. So the countershaft gear is going to go in the case first. Then the main shaft. Alright, nothing hard about that. Let me get my synchronizer blocker ring and my pilot bearing, and I'll show you how to get that main drive gear installed. So I used a little bit of wheel bearing grease to keep that thrust bearing in place, as well as my blocker ring. Every time I tried to go in with the gear, everything kept falling apart. I have the pilot bearing or pocket bearing pre-lubricated in the shaft. So this gear's a little tricky to get in. You just kind of rotate it, stick it in one side first, and then rotate it right in. And then it's as simple as lining up your bearings, and you're all set. So I just bumped the main shaft bearings in. They're not in perfect position, but just enough to hold the shaft. Now I'm going to flip the case over, and I'll put the countershaft bearings in. I put my new seal in. You can almost push that in with your fingers if you lube it up a little bit. You can take a socket that fits the outside diameter and just a little tap to finish it off. You have this little oil deflector that goes in here and a spacer. I use some heavy grease, wheel bearing grease, to hold that in place, and wheel bearing grease on this lower countershaft bearing spacer. And there are 6 flange head bolts that go in this cover. Just center it up on there and put your bolts in. So I used high temp gray silicone as a gasket maker for that front bearing retainer, and I also put some silicone on the threads of the bolts because they go all the way through the case. This rear retainer has an arrow for up, but you really can't put it on wrong. I don't know why they bothered to do that. But it's held on by 6 bolts with washers, and I also put some gel Loctite on those bolts. So this is the order of assembly. First of all, your little ball, don't forget that. I use a little bit of wheel bearing grease to stick it in place. Then this sleeve, which I have pre-lubed, and you see where the little ball engages the sleeve. Then overdrive gear. And it has a split bearing, 2 halves, and I pre-lubed everything. Then the synchronizer hub. Now it has what I call the dogs, and they're going to need to engage this ring. So I think I'll just do it this way. So it drops in when you get it correct. It'll drop all the way in. Make sure I got it turned the right way, and that is it. Then we'll just slide it down on there. Then there are these 2 little retainers. Go right in here. And then finally, this thrust washer is cut out on one side to go over those 2 retainers. So I've slept since I took this transmission apart. I forgot to put my shift fork and bar in the housing. There's a special bolt that holds it in, but it all has to go down together. And it's a little aggravating. There we are, back where we started. Two little retainer rings. The cutout thrust washer. Reverse gear. And it has 2 needle bearings. Then we'll install reverse on the countershaft gear. Now I can put this bearing and the rear bearing on the main shaft. About to leave this off. This is a thrust washer for reverse gear. Now I can put my 2 bearings on. Okay, I'll get something to drive that down. So I drove my 2 bearings down. Don't forget this screw in the side that holds this shift bar. I put a little bit of Loctite on it as well. So next I need to put my 2 nuts on to hold my bearings in place. So I took this one off with a punch. I'm going to put it back on with a punch. This one I can use a ratchet on. It's 1 1/4 inches. So I've tightened and staked both the nuts. I'm sure they have a torque. You'd have to have a special socket to torque this one, but I just tightened them up good and tight, and I think that'll work okay. I thought maybe I'd messed up by not putting this reverse idler in. It definitely would be easier to put in before you put that bearing on, but it has this odd shaped thrust washer that goes on first. I've pre-lubed everything a little bit, and I'm just leaving the bearing out. It drops in there. This bolt goes in the side, and I'm just going to start it and run it up. I'm not going to tighten it until I get the rear case on. I'm not sure that's the correct procedure, but that's the way I'm going to do it. Okay, I just have this in. It's still a little bit loose. There's the needle bearing that goes next. Another thrust washer. A snap ring. And these pliers are definitely overkill, but that's all I have handy. And that's that. Also, it would probably been easier to have put this little shift fork in or shift lever before I put all these gears in, but it will go. This piece goes in from the side, again held by the bolt. And there's a little washer. And a snap ring. I'm going to put that on without you watching because it's probably going to go flying across the floor. So that snap ring went in like it had eyes, as my dad used to say. But I had the correct snap ring pliers to do that instead of trying to get it out the way I did when I took it apart. I need to get this oil trough in the front. That's easy enough. Put some sealer on that bolt because it goes through the case. So I'm going to put the top cap on my gear lever in just to run this thing through the paces. Make sure everything functions properly. And then I'll put the rear cover on and it'll be ready to install. So I have everything in neutral in the gearbox. All my shift blocks are lined up, so the cap's in neutral. Got my rubber seal in place. I installed those steel expansion plugs to replace the rubber ones that came from the factory. That's a leaking point for these transmissions. Pretty simple to get the shift cap on if you hold your mouth right. There it is. Got the bolts in it and we'll see how it works. Alright, let's check it out. First gear. Second gear. Third gear. Fourth gear. And overdrive. And reverse. Looks like everything's working. Okay, I have some high temp gray on for my gasket. I was about to get ahead of myself. Got this little ball stuck in place for my speedometer gear with some wheel bearing grease. Snap ring holds that on. Have this rubber piece, goes down against it. Now I can set my cover on. And get some bolts in. Okay, all my bolts are in. I've torqued this bolt that holds the reverse idler shaft. The only parts I have left are these two bolts, and they hold my clutch cylinder in. So I'm going to install this thing and run it up the flagpole and see if it'll fly. So the Dangerous Ranger #2 transmission is happy. No more whining. That sounds like success, don't it? So I know the video's pretty condensed, but if you're mechanically inclined, I think there's enough information to help you get one put back together. If you need to know how to take it apart, visit my channel. There's a disassembly video that's condensed as well. Thanks for watching.